Major City, 1938. It was raining outside, and as the sky wept bitter tears on those mean streets of the city, a pair of eyes watched over the city like the eyes of God. These eyes belonged to a young man who was leaning back in his office chair with his feet propped up on his desk. A stack of papers, photos, and case reports he had no real intention of digging through right now, all laying out on his desk. In one hand, he had an unlit cigarette, and the other was a glass, half full with bourbon. As he glanced at the drink in his hand, he smirked to himself, recollecting the old days when he was just a boy and his parents would tell him things not to do. Don't run in the house, they'd say. Don't stay out past 9. Put that cigarette down. Don't you smoke in the house. But every time he was told not to do something, it was his very first instinct to try it. Maybe that's why this whole prohibition thing was such a stupid notion. Maybe the rest of America was just like him. You didn't have to really like the swill, but the real fear of danger and rebellion was all it took to draw people to it. He raised a cigarette to his teeth and sighed. He didn't really like smoking that much either, but again, James Troy wasn't the kind of person who liked being told what he could or couldn't do. Or maybe he just liked danger. After all, not just anyone would sign on to be a private eye detective. James had tried his hand at the force, but the longer he ran with the cowboys and the MCPD, the more he started to realize just how royally messed up the law actually was. To hell with that business. The kind of system would honestly let a rapist walk free because he was a little roughed up in the interrogation. Police brutality? Well, of course police were brutal. They had to be. Unlawful detainment? The bastard had tried to bolt out of a 3-story window, and it was all James could do not to let the idiot take a swan dive to the pavement below. If anything, the city should be thanking James for saving his life, not giving him a rip. But it didn't matter. He left that circus, and now worked on his own terms, and in his own way. At least most of the time. The door opened suddenly. She walked in, wearing her favorite coat, fedora on to keep the rain off. He liked that look on her. It was a classy look, and it made her look classy, though he tended to like it when she was just in a dress or dress-down attire. She let her long, wavy hair free, and the woman set her coat on the hanger by the door as she approached, her dark hair draping her like a mane. Her heeled boots clacked on the floor as she moved, and she stood in front of his desk, leaning across it, her rogue lips making the most alluring of smiles. "The famous James Troy sitting behind a desk with nothing to do but watch time tick by?" she asked. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you were getting sick of this private eye business." "Well, good thing you know better, Elizabeth," he answered. "I'm not sick of anything, just appreciating the little things." "Little things?" Elizabeth asked as she strolled around the desk and took off her hat, tossing it on hers, which was on the other side of the room. James turned his attention out the 5th-story window that he had been gazing out of and tried to look past the rain towards the harbor not too far away. "The world is sick, doll," he grumbled. "You know that better than most." "What of it?" she asked with a bit more venom to her tone than she probably meant. "If a man can't take a minute to appreciate moments of silence and solitude, then he'll go insane or just become a recluse." "Well, thank God in heaven that you spend so much time by yourself," Elizabeth teased. James smirked and took another sip of his drink. "Why, when I have a feisty partner like you around to irritate me on a day-by-day basis, I only get solitude in my sleep." "Don't lie, James. I nag you in your dreams, too." Elizabeth grinned at him, sitting at her chair. Her desk was far more neat and orderly than James was, but that's the way Elizabeth was. Elizabeth Frost hadn't originally been a detective like James had been. She used to be a singer at a nightclub in the Upper East Side. 2 years into her work before she started pushing towards Broadway, her mother and father were killed in a carjacking. Furious when the seemingly disinterested police department couldn't gather together enough evidence to find the killer, she'd come to James. And after she'd helped her find closure, she kinda just stuck around. At first she was annoyed, but in time James grew to recognize that she wasn't just a tumor on his livelihood. The girl had skills, especially when James needed to do any interrogating. The way she can bat an eye can make most men's heart melt. And put her in a cocktail dress and the wolves will come out to play, no question. Aside from being a femme fatale, she also had a keen eye for detail, and James made sure to never go to a crime scene or stakeout without bringing her along. It's a shame she never became a detective. She would have done well. Actually, on second thought, no, strike that. The more James tried to picture it, the more he recognized how fast that life would have destroyed her. Unionized organizations like that tend to swallow up talented youths and spit them out like bad tobacco. He was certainly glad to have her as a partner, though, even if he would never say it to her face or without a gun to his head.
Have you looked at some of the open cases on your desk? Elizabeth asked.
Glanced at him, he answered absent-mindedly.
You sure? How can you tell what's even on your desk with the way it's jumbled up? Elizabeth teased. Do you even remember what color your desk is?
Brown, he growled.
Should I clean off your desk and check?
Well, that depends. Got a nice little maid outfit to wear while you do it, James remarked. Elizabeth just giggled and shook her head as she opened the drawer to her desk and began shuffling through papers and folders. James grinned back and took another swig from his glass, glancing out the window to the rainy sky.
Well, sexual fantasies aside, you really need to take a look at this, Elizabeth muttered, standing up, having found the file she was looking for.
James turned his attention to the manila envelope she was holding and plucked it out of her hands, opening it and glancing at the case. The Harbor murder? He asked. I thought the NCPD had that one.
They did, but there's something fishy about it, Elizabeth explained.
She then grinned at her own joke, and James rolled his eyes as he looked over the case notes.
The client was one Abigail Gutierrez. Her brother was the one killed.
Pablo Gutierrez. Body found floating in the harbor. Bruising on his neck, and the ME ruled it death by strangulation, James added. Yeah, I remember that, but still, the MCPD can handle this one. Why is Miss Gutierrez asking us to investigate?
Well, it's been 2 weeks since the murder, and there aren't any solid leads. Besides, Pablo Gutierrez had a history with the police himself. He was arrested twice for violating the prohibition statutes and was suspected to be a runner for the mafia. Most of the police probably think it was mob-related and are expecting the mob to clean up their own mess.
But you think different.
During my singing days, I've seen plenty of mob tough guys walk in and out of the door. I know what the mob is like. They aren't the type of people who deal with in-house problems by quietly strangling you and dumping your body.
Guess that's a good point. Last snitch the mafia dealt with was sent to the hospital with enough broken bones he could have restocked a dog food store, James mumbled, thinking it over. So it's too quiet and subtle to be mafia.
And the police have probably already written him off as just a mafia hit gone wrong, so they're basically leaving it alone, Elizabeth added, which means the killer is still in the wind.
It's a sad day when lowlives like us are more reputable than the police, James chuckled. He pulled out the autopsy reports and the crime scene photos. James paused on one of the photos of the man's torso. What was the victim's job?
He worked security on the harbor. Supposedly that's how he was smuggling in alcohol in shipping containers, Elizabeth answered.
Well, look at this photo. James pulled out the picture and laid it on his mountain of paperwork. He pointed to the neck where the bruises were most prominent. Those bruises, the choke patterns, they look off. Notice how the bruise is darker around the front of the neck, but faded everywhere else. In fact, from the back, he pulled out a second photo, which showed the back of the victim's neck. I don't see much bruising at all, if any.
How's that weird?
James leaned back in his chair and exposed his neck to Elizabeth. Put your hands on me like you wanted to choke me.
Elizabeth shrugged and did so, not squeezing in any way, but wrapping her fingers, applying enough pressure to show that she was placing her hands in the appropriate spots.
What part of your hands would be applying the most pressure?
My thumbs and fingers.
Right. Strangulation by the hands is usually more broad, with a deep bruising around the neck, especially as the victim struggles against your grip. We'd see at least some bruising on the back and sides of the neck. But here there's barely any.
You think it was done by hand? You don't think it was done by hand then?
No. I think it was probably a rope or a chain, some kind of garrote instrument, James answered. James stood up and walked around Elizabeth, removing his belt from his pants and wrapping his belt lightly around Elizabeth's neck to demonstrate. From behind, all I have to do is pull back on the two sides of the rope and apply pressure with my foot to your back. James placed his foot close to the small of Elizabeth's back to show what he meant, and Elizabeth's eyes lit up in surprise.
He never saw his attacker. They were behind him.
Well, that's my thinking. We'll take a trip to the medical examiner's office and see if he can't shed a few more details on the corpse. But from the looks of things, Pablo was assaulted from behind and strangled, and there's no bruising or cuts on his body otherwise, so he likely didn't put up a fight. He was jumped.
So maybe he was targeted, Elizabeth asked. But if it's not the mob, why target Pablo Gutierrez?
We should talk to his sister. See if Pablo was hiding any dirty little secrets, James offered. He began strapping his belt back on and reaching for his coat and hat. Let's try not to step on the toes of the MCPD. They may not be taking this case seriously, but I'd rather not get them upset with me.
Want me to take the sister while you handle the ME? Elizabeth asked.
I'd actually prefer if you stuck close to me on this one. Our purpose, someone who kills without warning and from behind. Until we catch this guy, I want someone watching my back, he growled.
Anyone ever tell you you're a little paranoid? Elizabeth asked.
James nodded. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean there isn't someone out there to get you. Half of why I'm alive right now is because I don't double-check every dark corner and every unloaded gun.
I'll remember that, Elizabeth nodded.
She was a smart woman. James couldn't stop feeling proud of her for that. She learned fast and adapted to her situations and environment. Elizabeth Frost never stopped growing as an investigator. But James knew she had one last lesson to learn, and it might be the one she needed most of all. The most fundamental rule of the streets of Major City. Trust nothing, and always verify. She was still a little naive to understand that truth. She could keep thinking that way for now, sure. She didn't need to know how many background checks that James had done on Elizabeth before taking her in as his partner. After one too many close calls, James couldn't afford to take chances. That's just the nature of this sick, exhausting city.